Wow, some seriously heavy stuff coming out of Bloachistan this week. I mean, the attack on that train, the Jafar Express, just a few days ago.
Yeah, the Baloch Liberation Army, the
Wow.
BLA, taking hostages, 59 people dead.
It's horrific. A
Yeah,
really grim reminder of what's going on over there.
absolutely. And what's really concerning is the chain reaction it set off. The BLA, they're fighting for independence from Pakistan. They claimed the train attack, and then, well, things escalated pretty quickly.
More attacks.
Yeah, coordinated attacks.
Right.
The DLA and then the TTP, Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, they hit a military base in Quetta.
And the BLA is claiming they killed, 90 Pakistani soldiers.
Yeah, through their Majid Brigade.
Yeah.
The military denies it, of course, but
But even the claim itself is chilling, speaks volumes about how intense this fight has become.
no doubt. And, this isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern we've been seeing really for a while now.
It's true. Looking back at last year, you had those BLA attacks in August. Highways, police stations, railways.
Over 70 people killed in those.
Exactly. And then that suicide bombing at the Quetta railway station in November, over 30 dead. It's a lot. You start to see it's not just a sudden flare-up. There's something deeper going on here.
There absolutely is. This current wave of violence,
Yeah.
it's rooted in a much longer struggle. The BLA, these Baloch groups, their core issue is independence. They say Pakistan has occupied their land since 1948, and they've been fighting ever since.
It's a historical grievance, then, that's driving all of this.
Exactly. That sense of injustice, that feeling of being occupied, it's at the heart of what we're seeing today. And then, of course, you have the international dimension, other countries getting pulled into the mix.
Right. Well, Pakistan didn't waste any time blaming India, as usual. They claimed India was behind the train hijacking, operating through Afghan territory.
Predictable, perhaps, but it adds a whole other layer of complexity to this. They haven't provided any proof, and India has denied it completely. But it just goes to show how fraught the relationships are in this region. You have two nuclear-armed states.
With a history of conflict. To make sense of any of this, we need to look further back, don't we? You mentioned Balochistan becoming strategically important during the British Indian Empire, especially after that first Anglo-Afghan war. What happened?
It's interesting, isn't it, how things that happened centuries ago still resonate today. The British, after their setbacks in Afghanistan, they realized just how crucial Balochistan was. They saw it as a buffer zone, essentially, a way to prevent the Russians from pushing further towards India.
The Russians.
Yeah, at the time, the big fear was Russian expansion. And Balochistan, well, it gave relatively easy access to places like Kandahar and Herat in Afghanistan. So the British, they were obsessed with keeping the Russians out of that region.
So Balochistan became this pawn in a bigger geopolitical game.
Exactly. And the British made a series of agreements, drew borders that, well, they divided Balochistan, really. And those decisions have had lasting consequences, as we're seeing now.
You're talking about the Goldsmith Line, right?
That's one of them. Drawn in 1871, reaffirmed in 1896. Basically, it split Balochistan, gave the western part to Persia, which is modern-day Iran, and the bigger eastern chunk stayed under British control. There were other agreements with Iran, too, in 1870, 1896, and 1905, all solidifying that division. And, of course, there's the ever-contentious Durand Line, too.
Right, drawn in 1893. That one's still a major issue today.
It is. The British, they drew it to separate British India from Afghanistan, but it cut right through Balochistan. Split Baloch communities, essentially.
Arbitrary lines on a map.
With very real consequences. The British didn't really care about the existing ethnic and tribal boundaries. They just wanted a clear line, and it created a mess that we're still dealing with.
A mess that got even messier with the 1947 partition, an independent Balochistan that was never really on the table, was it?
It wasn't. When Pakistan was created, they moved very quickly to annex Balochistan, made it one of their provinces. And it wasn't peaceful.
Not at all. April 1948, they sent troops into Kalat.
Dissolved the Baloch parliament, arrested the Khan of Kalat.
And his brother, Prince Karim, he tried to resist.
He did, in May of 48, but he was eventually captured. It set the tone, really. Pakistan asserted its control by force, and the Baloch people were, well, they were left with this feeling of being betrayed, their hopes for independence crushed.
And then came the one-unit plan in 1955. That seems to have added fuel to the fire.
It was meant to simplify things, on paper anyway. Merge the four provinces of West Pakistan, Punjab, Sindh, Balochistan, and the Northwest Frontier Province into one unit.
To match East Pakistan, which is Bangladesh now.
Right. But the Baloch leaders saw it as an attack on their identity, a way to erase their autonomy.
So this plan to create unity
Actually ended up galvanizing the Baloch movement. They demanded the plan be dissolved, and it just reinforced their desire for independence.
It shows you how these top-down decisions, without taking local sentiment into account.
They can backfire spectacularly.
Yeah.
Then, under Ayub Khan, you had Nawab Noroz Khan leading the second major resistance movement. And that ended tragically, didn't it?
It did. Now, Raz Khan agreed to negotiate. He was given assurances of safety.
Promises were made. They said they'd address Baloch grievances.
But it was a trap.
It was.
Yeah.
Now, Raz Khan, his sons, a nephew, they were all arrested.
And executed.
A turning point, really.
Yeah.
It cemented the idea that the fight for Balochistan was tied to their ethnicity, their identity as Baloch people.
Mm-hmm.
And it solidified the desire for independence even further.
And the cycle continued. In the 1970s, under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto,
Bhutto dissolved the elected Baloch nationalist government. You had key figures like Ghostbucks Bazenjo, Sardar Atala Mengal, Kerbaksh Mari, and Nawab Akbar Khan Bugti too, actually.
And what followed?
Another massive military operation that lasted 5 years. Kerbaksh Mari, he formed the Balochistan People's Liberation Front. The Mari and Mengal tribes, many of them went into the mountains. Guerrilla warfare against the Pakistani state.
More bloodshed, more resentment, and still no solution.
Exactly. The same pattern kept repeating. Under Musharraf, too, the military operations continued. Places like Darabukti and Kolu, those became hotbeds of resistance.
And then in 2006, you had the killing of Nawab Akbar Bugti, a real turning point, even though he wasn't so central in the earlier uprising.
It was symbolic. Bugti, his death, it galvanized the Baloch nationalist movement. He became a martyr, a powerful symbol of resistance.
Mm-hmm.
You look in the timeline, 1948, 1958, 59, 1962, 63, 1973, 77, and then the ongoing struggle since 2003. Yeah. It's been relentless. And Pakistan's response, always the same. Military force, which clearly hasn't worked.
And then there's a whole economic dimension to this, too. Balochistan is incredibly resource-rich, isn't it?
It is strategically located with access to the Persian Gulf, and then you have the natural resources, coal, minerals, oil, gas. It's astounding.
Reko Diq, right. That's one of the biggest copper gold deposits in the world.
Billions of tons of ore, millions of ounces of gold, and that's just one site. You have the Sandak Copper Gold Project already operational.
Producing copper, gold, silver.
Exactly. And then the Chagai district. Massive iron ore deposits there. Balochistan is Pakistan's leading producer of chromite. They have lead, zinc, huge gold reserves, limestone, marble, you name it. And, of course, the Sui gas field.
That's the big one, isn't it? Discovered in 1953, provides a huge chunk of Pakistan's gas.
It does. But all this wealth
Doesn't seem to be benefiting the Baloch people.
Exactly. There's a history of disputes over royalties, especially from the Sui gas field. Back in 1958, the Bugti tribe, they actually tried to cut off the gas supply. They wanted fairer payments from the government.
They felt exploited, basically.
They did. And in 1973, the Constitution, it set the rules for gas royalties, but it was based on the 1953 production levels, which were much lower. So Balochistan lost out on a lot of potential revenue, and all these resources being extracted, it just fueled resentment.
It's a familiar story, isn't it? A marginalized region, rich in resources.
And the local people see little to no benefit, and then you have the discovery of those mass graves in Kuzdar.
Right. That's a chilling reminder of the human cost of all of this.
It suggests a complete disregard for the Baloch people. Their lives, their rights, all seemingly sacrificed in the pursuit of profit.
And then China enters the scene. What our port, the CPEC. That seems to have made things even worse for the Baloch people.
China's arrival. It's shifted the dynamics. Pakistan sees Gwadar and the CPEC as crucial for their economy. But many Balochis, they see it as another form of exploitation.
They feel like they're losing control of their own land.
Exactly. The security fence around Gwadar, the pass system for residents, the stories of humiliation at checkpoints, it all creates this feeling of being under siege.
And the sentiment against CPEC is strong.
Very strong. There's a deep sense of mistrust towards the Chinese. And it's not just based on feelings either. There are concrete examples of how the Baloch people are being marginalized. Take the Sandak project, for example.
Right, the profit sharing there.
The Chinese company gets a big share. The Pakistani federal government gets a big share. And Balochistan, they get a tiny 6.5% in royalties. And then there's the issue of jobs. Chinese companies often prioritize Chinese workers, even for skilled positions. Local Balochis get pushed into the low-paying jobs.
Creating more resentment.
Exactly. And it's not just Sandak. You see similar things at the Dudder lead zinc mine, too. They prefer Chinese speakers, even for unskilled labor.
So it's a pattern of economic marginalization.
It is. And when you combine that with a political oppression, the military presence, it creates this perfect breeding ground for instability.
Which is why you have groups like the Taliban, Jundallah, Al-Qaeda, all operating in the region.
Exactly. These groups thrive on chaos, they exploit the existing grievances, and Quetta, it's become a haven for various Taliban factions.
Which makes you wonder about who's really pulling the strings here. There's that theory that the Taliban's resurgence in Balochistan, it's not just a coincidence.
Right, the theory is that the U.S. is involved, that they're using the Taliban or even manipulating them to disrupt things in Balochistan.
To undermine Gwadar.
Exactly. Gwadar is a key part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. The U.S. doesn't want to see China gaining more influence in the region and to destabilize Balochistan. Well, it could also help secure U.S.-favored energy routes from Central Asia.
And maybe even provide leverage over U.S. military bases in the Gulf.
Right. And some people go even further, claiming that the CIA is funding terror groups in the area.
But that's unverified, right?
It is. But even the possibility is concerning. And then you have the allegations of Israeli involvement.
Mossad, right, working with groups like Jundallah to attack Iranian interests.
Right. There were reports back in 2012 and even CIA memos from 2007-2008 suggesting that Mossad was recruiting Jundallah operatives in Balochistan. They wanted them to carry out attacks inside Iran.
And they were allegedly posing as CIA agents to do it.
That's what some reports claim. The Bush administration was apparently pretty upset when they found out about it. They were worried about the blowback, how it could endanger American personnel in the region.
It just shows you how complicated all of this is. So many players, so many agendas.
And then you throw ISKP into the mix.
Right, the Islamic State in Khorasan province, active on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. And they just claimed responsibility for that attack in Moscow.
ISKP. They're a growing threat. They're based in Afghanistan and parts of Central Asia, but they've found a foothold in southern and eastern Afghanistan, places where the Taliban's grip might not be as strong.
And the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Didn't help. All that military equipment they left behind. Some people say it's helped ISKP grow. And then there are those who believe Imran Khan was ousted specifically to reactivate the Karachi-Quetta-Kandahar pipeline.
As part of some bigger strategy involving these extremist groups.
It's a theory, but it's not without merit. And this whole ISKP situation, it's actually led to some strange bedfellows.
You mean Russia getting closer to the Afghan Taliban?
Exactly. They're even considering delisting them as a terrorist organization. They see ISKP as a threat to Central Asia, so they're willing to work with the Taliban to counter them.
And India, too. They're engaging with the Taliban diplomatically, providing aid.
They're worried about groups like ISKP and AQIS using Afghan territory to launch attacks. So, yeah, it's a strange situation. You have old enemies now cooperating out of shared concern.
And on top of all that, you have the internal divisions within the Taliban itself, the Akhundzada faction in Quetta.
Versus the Haqqani network, it creates a lot of instability. And then you have the Pashtuns, many of whom don't recognize the Durand Line as a legitimate border.
That's got to be a headache for Pakistan.
It is. They have this long, porous border.
And internal divisions within the group they're relying on for security. It makes you wonder about Pakistan's constant accusations against India. I mean, they're quick to blame India for the trouble in Balochistan.
But they've got their own history of supporting militant groups.
Osama bin Laden, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, they were both sheltered in Pakistan, weren't they?
They were. Pakistan has a long and complicated history with these extremist organizations. Some have called them the mother node of terrorism. So they're finger-pointing at India. It rings a bit hollow, doesn't it?
It does. And it's interesting, you brought up General Asad Durrani.
The former DG-ISI.
Right. And in his book, The Spy Chronicles, he's pretty candid about Pakistan's mistakes in Balochistan. And he even suggests the U.S. has played a role in stirring up trouble there.
He does. He says the U.S. has used groups like Jundallah to target Shias in Iran, to keep Iran off balance, to justify a U.S. presence in the region.
He calls it a new great game, right?
He does. Just like the old great game between Britain and Russia, except now it's all about containing China's access to the Persian Gulf. And these militant groups, they're just pawns in this bigger game.
It makes you wonder what the end game is here. I mean, we have this incredibly resource-rich region, strategically vital.
But trapped in a cycle of conflict and oppression.
And now with all these external players involved, China, Russia, India, the U.S., Israel, it feels like the stakes are higher than ever.
They are. The question is, what happens next? The Baloch people have legitimate grievances. They've been marginalized, exploited. Their land has been used as a battleground for outside forces.
So the question you leave us with is this. Is another major shift inevitable in this region? And if so, what will it look like? How will it impact the rest of the world?
It's a question worth pondering. This isn't just about Balochistan. This has the potential to reshape the entire geopolitical landscape.
A lot to think about. Thanks for helping us unpack all of this.
My pleasure.